it's very easy for people in the tech industry to make it all about tech. What else can I get? What's the latest toy? What's the newest piece of equipment that I have to have? Very easy to fall into that trap. And if you read trade magazines, I'm reading articles almost daily just to stay abreast of what's going on. One of those, Church Production Magazine, if you haven't heard of it, you can get that for free. Email, print version, whatever the case may be, their website, wonderful tools and resources that you can get through there. And they also have a yearly conference and whatnot that you can pay for, but the magazine is a wonderful resource. So that's one of them that I read. And people are always talking about the latest tech. But if you read the articles long enough and the different suggestions from the people that do this all the time, you'll start to sense that it's not about the technology. It's about the right tool for the job. And just keeping that in mind so that we're not equipment chasing, but looking for what we need. Secondly, technology doesn't create the message. But without it, if done well, the technology aids the message. If done poorly, the message can be blocked. And so that's the ultimate reason why I feel so strongly in making sure that I do what I do to the best of my ability. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. So we won't, but that sort of sets the framework for how I look at technology and what I'm doing. So let's browse through here really quick at what we're going to talk about. We'll give an overview of what a public address sound system is for. We'll talk about some of the components that go into it, setting it up. And while some of this may sound basic, time and time again, I was just at a church this weekend where I looked and I said, if they only knew. It's one of the things, I can plug a cable in and I can make it work, and I'm done, right? But then when there's issues, you're not sure why. And so going back to the fundamentals and the basics can be very helpful, even for people who've been doing this for quite a while. So we'll talk about setting it up from just right in from the beginning. Talk about some common problems and solutions, and also troubleshooting. Give you some places to look. Talk a little bit about wireless mics. This is one of the biggest things on the horizon that some of you may be dealing with, and so we want to look at that a little bit. And then planning, and then just looking back at everything again. Any product reference that I illustrate, there's some common tools of the trade. This microphone right up here, we'll talk about that particular model later on. Please don't take that as a recommendation for your situation. There's so many tools out there. It's finding the right tool for the job. What are some of the different career paths that we have? Do we have computer people, photographers? What do we have going on out here? Nursing? Printer. A printer, all right.
Radiology technologists.
Wonderful. Treasurer? All right. Nursing, let's just pick on that. I know there's another nurse back here. If you use the wrong needle, if you use wonderful needle, this is the one the rep just came and said, this is the best needle on the market, and you use it for the wrong purpose, is it the right needle? All right. So I can tell you about a microphone or a soundboard or whatever the case may be. Might be wonderful and great, might be the latest technology, but it might not be the right one for your environment. So anything that it's just illustrative, please don't take that as an answer for your situation. Sound reinforcement, what is it? Thanks to Wikipedia, who uses encyclopedias anymore, right? Wikipedia, combination of microphones, signal processors, amplifiers, loudspeakers that makes live or pre-recorded sounds louder and may also distribute those sounds to a larger or more distant audience. A lot of different parts, all working together, hopefully like the same situation in your churches, a lot of different people coming together as a team, making it all work together. So that's sort of the purpose of sound reinforcement. Might I add that you also want it to sound as natural as possible. You're not trying to change the sound, you're trying to amplify it. And if it's not sounding natural, then maybe we need to look at what we're doing and how we're doing it. So the big picture. Who thinks of AV and technology ministry in your church as part of guest services? Wonderful. Perfect. I was reading an article not too long ago, and it suggested this exact same thing in Church Production Magazine, interestingly enough. When people come to church, there's all sorts of distractions that can turn them away, right? From the minute they walk in, the minute they drive into the parking lot, do they know where they're going? Are they comfortable with what's happening? Is the message what they're looking for? If technology is disruptive, it's one more reason why they may not want to come back. It can block the message from getting to them. One story that this particular article used, this person's just come and sat down. Maybe they're a little bit late even. Just sat down, and all of a sudden, this person in black goes running down the aisle up to the stage. What's going on? They're new here. Is there a fire? Do they need to evacuate? They don't know what's going on. Everyone sort of looks around for a minute. Some of the church members are like, oh yeah, this is normal, whatever. That's not the type of environment we're wanting to create, right? So while it may not be considered traditional guest services, there's a very important element to technology, not trying to make it more important than it is, but it is very important to make guests feel comfortable with the environment that they've come to. In the Bible, we hear the story of the feeding of the 5,000. It was getting to be lunchtime, supper time, whatever, however you wanted to read into it. It was a mealtime. What happened? Jesus didn't want all the people to leave, right? It could be a distraction. Would they come back? Was there more that they could learn? He found a boy with one lunch and made it feed everybody. The message that I see out of that is he didn't want a reason to turn people away. I don't want technology to be a reason to turn people away from hearing the message that God has put in store for that day. The pastor especially has a sermon that he's prepared. The worship team has prepared their songs. I don't want I don't know how to use this piece of equipment to deter any of that. Who sees AV technology as art? Okay, we have some hands, absolutely. Who sees it as science? All right. Who sees it as both? Wonderful. There are some fundamentals of what make it work. But every technician, and there's sort of a joke that you talk to one sound engineer and they're going to disagree with how the other sound engineer is doing it. You're going to talk to somebody else and all of them aren't going to agree. There's a little bit of truth to that. And none of them might be wrong. It's just each one looks at things a little different way, does their own little spin on it, and makes it theirs. So it is absolutely part science and part art. What are some goals? We want even coverage across the room. Why do you think that's important? Absolutely. If it's not even, part of the room might just be way too loud, and part of the room might just be way too soft, and so it's distracting. We're not going to talk a lot about setting up a system, because in most of your situations, how many of you are in portable situations? Just ask that. Okay, so we've got a couple. So that's why I'm not going to talk a lot about it. Most of your churches are pre-set up. Now, if it is an issue, let me just say this. Find a good company near your church that you can work with to come in and do some consultation. There's a myriad of different speaker solutions out there, and that is not an area that I am even comfortable with, even working with a wide variety of speakers over my career, portable setups and installed. It's just, I can install them, but you tell me what I need from an integrator, and we'll make it work. So if you don't know of a good company, talk with some churches. One of the amazing things, as I've been across this industry and gone to different workshops, a lot of churches of other denominations are very willing to help other churches with their tech ministry. So I just did this actually 6 months ago with the church I'm at. I just looked at a couple churches in the area, in the Atlanta area, and wanted to find, first, to get a grasp of, do they take tech seriously? Because I don't want to talk to a church that throws up 2 little speakers on some tripods and it squeal every week. I'm looking for a church that understands good quality production. Found about 3 or 4 of those. Called the church in some cases. Some of them actually had the tech contact online. Emailed them, called them, whatever the case may be, and they gave me different references to companies that they work with. And I think a couple of those churches even use the same company. Well, I said, perfect. Now I know who I want to talk to, and they're just down the road. It happens to be from the church that I go to. Very willing to share the resources that they have and who they use. So if you're looking for somebody in your area, that's definitely one way. I've been hesitant for years to do that, but when I did it, I was very blessed and happy that I did. We want it loud enough for everyone to hear clearly, clearly being the key. And we'll talk about EQ, which is probably one of the primary reasons or methods to make it clear. We want it to be distraction-free, which we've talked a lot about, and we want a balanced mix. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well. A pleasing sound. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well as we go on. EQ playing a very important part in that. So some main concepts. Main components, sorry. Microphones. Mics, I've seen them spelled M-I-K-E-S. Typically it's M-I-C-S, just here. We have a mixer. We have some processors. We're not going to talk a lot about processors. It's a little more advanced. I'm glad to talk more about that if you want, and depending on how time goes, we can demo. One of the most useful processors outside of what you have on a standard analog board. We'll talk about processors a little bit. What are some different types of processors that maybe you've heard of, that maybe you're using? Who has an EQ in between their speakers and their sound mixer? EQ? All right. How many of you don't? Let's put it that way. One. Don't. How many don't know? All right. I didn't include a picture of a graphic EQ, but it is a box approximately the width of this mixer with a whole bunch of vertical sliders typically on the front that go up and down, and that adjusts in a full-size 31 band EQ. That adjusts all those different frequencies going out to your speakers. It'll be after your mixer, before your speakers. If you have an amplifier, again, which we're not going to talk a lot about because I want to delve into the nuts and bolts of hands-on use, it'll be in there.
Ours is actually all built in. We have the digital board.
Okay.
So kind of bypass it.
Perfect. So yeah, and we'll talk analog digital. I'm going to, most of my references are going to be analog related just because it's easier to understand sometimes, but digital boards are definitely advantages to that. So it just adjusts your overall sound so that we'll use a concert tour analogy. This group sets up, they've practiced in their warehouse, where they've set up and tested all their equipment. And these are the speakers that they're going to use for their concert. They're going to load them into a semi-truck and they're going to go on the road. They set their EQ and it sounds how they want it. They go into venue A, they set up their speakers, but the acoustics and the way the frequencies work in that room are all different. All they have to do is run their EQ out to a flat EQ, and the system sounds fairly similar, as close as they're going to get it, really, to when they're practicing. All they have to do is do some minor tweaks here and there. All their settings on their board are going to be very similar from when they rehearsed. They go to venue B. fly their speakers, and it's different from where they practice and venue A. They set their EQ, on they go. So a house EQ, a main EQ just helps everything equal out, so you're doing less on your soundboard. You may find on your soundboard that you're always adjusting one frequency. Well, maybe you should be adjusting that on your house EQ and leave your couple bands of EQ on your mixer to actually get the sound where you want it instead of trying to fix issues there. So processors, we have EQ, we have compressors, which help normalize the sound down so it's not quite as dynamic. Dynamic being how loud from the lowest spots to from the softest spots to the loudest spots. It just helps squish all of that. Much more important, I would say, in a recording setup and streaming, which we'll try to touch briefly on. Reverb effects, delay, echo, all that kind of stuff are the most common processors that you'll find in a live sound system setup. Amplifiers power the speakers so that the sound can get out. Some of those speakers are what we call powered or active, so there is no external amplifier. The amplifier is built in. There's pros and cons of that. Speakers and monitors. So microphones. This is an SM58. Who's heard of an SM58? I would consider it an industry standard. It is well known for, the story goes that on tour, somebody would take an SM58, there was a nail sticking out of the stage somewhere, wherever, they would take it, bang the nail in, plug it back in, it would keep working. Super durable, very well respected microphones. This one right here is an SM58. Again, I'm not saying this is what you need to use, but it is a very well respected microphone. They are cheap, relatively. Let's talk about price. Who buys equipment based on price? Or churches, right? Adventist churches, I had thought this for quite a while too. Oh, we're Adventist churches, we're cheap. This is across the board. And I will read time and time and time again of churches buying based, not Adventist, in trade articles, of churches buying based on price. SM58 is very cheap considering what it is. Where am I going with this? A church decided that they saw Christmas special. 4 microphones, $20. Woohoo, right? A year later, all but one of them was sitting in a closet not working. In the meantime, the sound quality was absolutely terrible. Was that $20 well spent? No. Absolutely not. And so that's the point. Sometimes we're trying to be good stewards and we say, I can get a microphone for less over here. Why don't I buy what I need instead of what I can afford? I'm not saying go into debt. I'm saying maybe I need to fundraise or look for a little extra revenue stream to help get what I need. Because if I don't have the tools that I need, the mission can't be accomplished. So buy to the mission. This is one of the things philanthropists and fundraisers understand very clearly. If I can sell the need, I can get the money. If all I'm doing is looking for money to put in a fund so I have, the money's not going to come in. When you're talking to your church board and looking for money, be sure you have a very clear vision and make sure your mission aligns with the church's mission. And more often than not, you may have to wait a little bit, but more often than not, the money will come in to get what you need and get the equipment that you need. All right, so we have a couple different microphones. We have dynamic microphones. Dynamic microphones do not require external power. Many of you have heard of phantom power. Some boards, there's just a switch on it to turn on phantom power. Other ones, it's by channel. If you're in some environments, you may need an external box to power the microphone. Dynamic microphones do not need power. The misconception is, well, I have, we'll keep going to the other microphone that does, then we'll talk a little bit more. There's a limited frequency response. They're not quite as sensitive as other types of microphones. It's not always a bad thing. Just something to be aware of. All right, so we have condenser microphones. These ones are powered. And you say, all right, well, I have a condenser microphone that needs power, and I have a dynamic microphone that doesn't need power. What do I do? If I can only turn on the switch for all of them, It doesn't matter. There's sometimes can be a misconception that I can't turn on power to ones that don't need it, and I'll ruin them. In a studio environment or with much higher end microphones, that can be the case. Ribbon microphones, for example, they can be damaged. But if you're buying those type of microphones, you probably also have a soundboard that you can individually turn on and off. So if all you can do is turn on phantom power on your whole board to make one mic work, so be it. How many of you use microphones to mic a baptism? We have some. There's different theories about that. Some people put a wireless mic in a Ziploc bag, whatever the case may be. I will never use a condenser microphone near a baptistry. Never. And I will also turn off phantom power to the whole board if I have to during a baptism. Because even if the microphone doesn't need it, it's just like a power outlet, an extension cord. If I plug it in on the plug on one end, and I take the other end and it's not plugged into anything, there's no power going through it. But as soon as I put a fork into it, I'm going to get shocked, right? The same thing. If the power can be traveling down through the cable, a pastor grabs a microphone that doesn't need it, but power's in the cable, you can still get shocked. So I will always turn off, if there's a microphone near a baptistry, I'll always turn off phantom power during a baptism. If you want to be...
What is
Phantom power. It sends 48 volts typically from the soundboard through an XLR cable down towards the microphone where the microphone can use it. The way it's engineered, and I'm not an engineer, so I'll keep it simple, it doesn't affect the sound at all. So there is no worry about interference or all this. If you're getting buzzes and hums, it's probably not because of phantom power being turned on. So it just, the board provides power to the microphone so the microphone capsule can work.
But it's a wired.
Yes, it is wired. If a microphone needs phantom power, say some lavalier mics that you clip on for a pastor, it'll get that from the battery in the wireless battery pack. But a condenser mic that needs phantom power, typically you won't have to plug in a second cable to it. It will just travel through the microphone cable already. All right, does that answer your question? Require external power. Okay, we talked on that. Greater frequency response. This is why people use them. Choirs, a wonderful situation for condenser microphones. Over top of drum kits, podium microphones, oftentimes where you want a little bit more clarity. A wider frequency response will use condenser microphones. Much more sensitive. You have to be really careful with condenser microphones when it comes to feedback. They're much more sensitive with volume, also with frequency. The way the microphone works, frequencies hit it and it transfers those frequencies much more easily to electrical signals which come into the soundboard. And so they pick up nuances that you might not get out of dynamic microphones. Large diaphragm and small diaphragm, that's the size of the microphone capsule. A larger diaphragm, just like a larger woofer in a speaker, you've heard of 18-inch subs, or people have big subwoofers in their car, right? Bigger the better, right? Sometimes, with condenser microphones, you have large diaphragm, small diaphragm. Typically speaking, a large diaphragm is going to be used, it has a warmer tone because the frequency response is a lot more flat and picks up more in the lower end. Often they're used for things such as cellos, making bass drum cabinets, upright bass, other instruments with lower frequencies. Not always, but that's often the case. The smaller diaphragms are the little ones that you see. They're small, choir microphones, whatnot. Who here always polar patterns is completely confused and you're not sure what they mean? I've been in that boat for years. I'm like, what? How many of you don't know what a polar pattern is? All right. This is why I wanted to touch on this, is understanding what microphones you have and how they work can greatly improve your sound and what you're looking for. You might only have a small selection of microphones right now, but when you're wanting to go and get something to do something else, you want to know what kind of microphone you're looking for. So you want to know the polar pattern. The polar pattern could also be considered the pickup pattern, how it picks up sound around the microphone. So we have what we call an omnidirectional microphone. It picks up, generally speaking, the same amount of sound all the way around it. With a handheld microphone that's considered an omnidirectional, it may dip down just a little bit in the back, but generally speaking, it's the same pickup all the way around it. So I took a Countryman E6 polar pattern. Who has Countryman headsets in their churches? Those are omnidirectional microphones. That is the polar pattern from Countryman's microphone. Or Countryman's spec sheet, sorry. So I trust that to be pretty accurate. You see how it's even all the way around? You can take a Countryman and bend it this way or that way. That's why you can put it on one side of the ear or the other side of the ear. It's even all the way around. Omnidirectionals aren't... You have to use them a little more carefully because they're also very sensitive to feedback because they're picking up sound from behind them. All right, so then we have Cardioid. Cardioid is probably one of the more common handheld microphone styles. An SM58 is a Cardioid microphone. Let's see if we can demo this here just a little bit. So I'm going to turn off. Check. All right, so you hear I'm talking into the front of it. Now as I rotate around the back of it, you hear how the sound disappears? As the side, here it comes back. So that's a Cardioid pickup pattern. Check, 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 check. So that's what a polar pattern looks like on a Cardioid microphone. See the difference? You also see, I left this in, how it changes depending on the frequency. It's just how it works, with different frequencies being more and less sensitive. All right, so then we have a hypercardioid microphone. Often, and this is what confuses people, oftentimes a cardioid microphone they think, oh, it's directional. Yes, it is directional. They are great when you want a little bit more feedback rejection from the sides. But how many of you have monitor speakers on your stage? Okay, so you have a music group that's up there singing, and there's a monitor wedge right in front of the microphone, and you're getting feedback, and you're like, why am I getting feedback? I have a hypercardioid microphone. See that little lobe off the back? That's just one of the trade-offs of hypercardioid pattern. They also pick up sound directly behind the microphone. So it's something to be aware of, that they're wonderful for feedback rejection on stages where you have a lot of other sounds. How many of you have worship bands? We'll use that, okay? So you might have we could have a scope here. We have violins, we have cellos, we have drum kits, we have guitars, whatever the case may be, and you have ambient sound on the stage, right? Well, how can you have clear sound, if that's your goal, if you're having all this other stuff come into your microphone? So they'll put hypercardioid microphones there so it rejects all that stuff going on around it. But then you have a monitor wedge right in front of it. So that's why in-ear monitors and all this other kind of stuff have become popular in larger churches. One solution, just move the monitor wedge off to the side a little bit. So instead of it being right underneath the microphone, move it a couple feet away and angle it up. You can still use your hypercardioid microphone but not have issues with feedback. All right, and so that's the pickup polar pattern there for a hypercardioid mic. A Shure Beta 87 is a model that is very common for especially vocalists, female vocalists, male vocalists sometimes. There's other models out there as well, but this is a very common model that Shure runs with wireless microphones and wired, so it's just a common model. You gain side rejection, but a trade-off is a little bit of sound coming in from... Normally, and this is why I talk about the solution with moving a monitor, is that's often where people will run into the issue. But if you need that side rejection and you have a monitor right there and you're getting feedback from it, just move the monitor off to the side and it will reject it. So then we're going to talk a little, just briefly on frequency response. This is a chart of a Shure Beta 57. And you see all of those, the line going across. And with numbers underneath it, those numbers underneath are frequencies. And then up and down is how sensitive it is to that frequency. A perfect microphone is flat. But that doesn't mean you want a perfect microphone, right? Sometimes you want the right microphone for the job. I'm just showing it there so you know what it is when you see it in the charts. It's just how sensitive it is to those different frequencies. I'll just tell you this. This is what I look for if I'm looking at a particular microphone. I go to the company website, and often they'll have tools that say, I want a microphone, I want for a cello. They're going to have a chart that says, this is a good microphone, this is a good microphone, this is a good microphone, recommended out of their lines. Well, who am I to argue with the manufacturer on what microphone is the right one for the job? The other option I'll do, I'll go to Google and I say, how to microphone a cello, or how to mic a cello. And I'll get all sorts of, live sound, tag live sound onto it. You'll get all these different suggestions, and you start researching the ones that are in your price point and might also do well for other situations that you might have, whatever the case may be. So I don't get super involved in frequency response charts, but I wanted to make them aware so you're not like, I'm totally confused. So we have analog boards. You're all used to these, right? And the reason once we get into it, go on analog boards, I can walk up to an analog board, look at it, and most people could. Once they understand one analog board, they can hop around and pick up another one pretty easily. Digital boards are not that way. If you're looking at upgrading boards in your churches, demo, and find one that meets everybody's, or as many people as possible, list, and as user-friendly as possible. And that's the biggest thing I have with the Personas. I just don't find them user-friendly. I went to a workshop by Yamaha. They wanted you to buy their products, obviously. That was the point of it. But it was actually very instructional and learned some wonderful stuff. Who knew that in big churches, how do you think they make choirs? Who's heard of Lakewood Church in Texas? Joel Osteen. Okay. How do you think they make a choir? All right. They put microphones there and they make them, right? And I don't know that this is how Lakewood does it, but several people in the room, one of them being the instructor, so you know how they do it? They take them to their recording studio, they record them, and when you see them singing, they may, if they're on, they may use the microphones there, but most of the sound that you hear on the broadcast side of it is pre-recorded. Who knew? And I picked that up at a Yamaha workshop. So, different tricks of the trade. If you're having problems with clarity in big churches, it may not be live. And I also tell you, Super Bowl is coming up, right? Do you know, typically, and I don't know what they're doing this time, it hasn't come out, but usually the halftime show, all pre-recorded, running on individual tracks in a production truck, and if one of the instruments gets off, there's supposed to be a tech monitoring that, and they'll bring in the pre-recorded instrument, singer, whatever the case may be. So it is a flawless performance. Don't always believe what you see, right? Back on track. All right, so we have analog consoles, very easy, and this is why we're going to learn on an analog console. The principles you can take back to a digital board if that's the situation you're in. And then we have a digital board. I just love Yamaha. The first big analog board, actually all big analog boards I've worked on have been Yamaha, and I just find them super user intuitive even on their digital side. Once you get past a certain several $1,000 threshold. But I'm not recommending this board per se. I like them. They're all different. You talk to different sound engineers. There's a million different, not quite, but you get the point. A lot of different digital boards, and they all have their purpose, and everyone likes them for different reasons on particular models. Speakers, we're not going to spend a lot of time here. We have passive, which means they require an amplifier. We have active, which means the amp is built in. The pros of an active, the amp is spec'd by the manufacturer. It's all set up and tuned, optimized technically for that speaker. The downside is, what happens when your speaker's 25 feet up in the air and something goes wrong? You're done. There's also some, and this I picked up from a guy in Chattanooga, actually, who doesn't sell anything he isn't certified to repair. You could look at that two different ways, but he doesn't want to repair stuff, I'll just tell you that. He doesn't like active because a speaker is always vibrating. Well, that vibration is wear and tear on the amplifier components. And so he feels that there's just premature wear in active speakers. I'm just telling you what I've heard. I don't have long experience with any one of them to say that, yes, that's absolutely the case. I've used both. The speakers we have at the Southern Union that we use for most of our events are active. So there's definitely reasons for them. In-ear monitors, it just helps reduce stage volume on stage. But if you get any, keep in mind that there's also a responsibility to keep the volume down as much as possible so you don't ruin ears. And you just have, when you make adjustments, the musician will pick that up much more sensitively. I've worked with in-ear monitors a few times, and I can tell you, I won't touch anything, and the person's like, did you change something? It sounds different. Didn't change anything. Subwoofers. Subwoofers often are used for the low frequencies in the sound spectrum frequency range. Low frequencies are non-directional. So that's why you often see them in the corners. They sort of just bounce off the walls, and the corner will help reinforce that. How many of you have subwoofers or multi-cabinet speakers in your, not two cabinets doing the same thing, but two cabinets doing different things, highs and lows? So we have one with subwoofers, okay, two. You have crossovers in place, right? Perfect. Crossovers, for those of you that don't know, and I mention this just so you start to be familiar if you're ever thinking about upgrading. You don't want to run all your frequencies to your top speakers if you have subwoofers. Why not? I'll even use a crossover actually in events where I don't have lower frequency sounds and I just want to cut it out. Cutting out the lower frequencies for regular speakers aren't designed for your low frequencies. They're just not. And so if you can cut them out, the speaker is a little more optimized, we say, and has a clearer sound and just runs better, just sounds better. Cleans up the sound by cutting out what you don't need. So a crossover, when you have multiple speakers, sends just the low frequencies to your subs and just the upper frequencies to your tops. And so you don't have overlapping frequencies and one frequency being too strong. Just cleans everything up. All right. Cables. Balanced versus unbalanced. I still have to check myself, all right, which way is which? And this presentation has actually helped reinforce it. An unbalanced signal is a positive and a negative. That's it. Audio cables running long distances are susceptible to interference. So if you have just a positive and negative and interference comes in, the soundboard doesn't know what to do with it and just sends the interference on through. A balanced cable runs two wires for positive and one for negative, ground, but in inverse. And this is what this diagram shows. The wave is traveling. Well, on one cable, the wave may start going up, and on the other cable, the wave may start going down. Well, if you think back to physics class, if you have one positive and one negative, what do you get in math? You get 0, right? Well, the soundboard does the exact same thing with a balanced signal. It takes the wave going up and the wave going down, it subtracts them, and to get the normalized output, any differences are removed. So if interference hits a cable, it is going to spike at the same point. Well, the soundboard is when it sees that, it's going to remove that. So that's a sort of explanation. That's what this is showing here on the graph. Basically, you want balance. That's exactly it. Any cable over approximately 10 feet, you really want balanced. Fluorescent microphones, power cables, whatever all that kind of stuff can induce interference. So running a balanced cable is typically going to help you guard against that. Yeah?
Any reason to use an unbalanced
Yes. The short answer. I don't have any. How many of you have guitars or keyboards in your churches? Electric pianos, all right? Those instruments aren't a balanced output. So you have to use an unbalanced. Now we have a handy little box here. What we call a direct box. So when you have unbalanced cables coming out of an instrument, you plug them into a direct box, and that will take the signal and convert it into a balanced signal. So with transformers and all this kind of different stuff. So if you don't have any of these and you have instruments running around, not to be confused with an adapter that can also convert a 1/4 inch to an XLR cable. That does not change the balance to an unbalanced signal. So something to be aware of. So those of you that have used guitars or keyboards, electric pianos in your churches, I know of a small church that 10 attendees on a weekly Sabbath, they use an electric piano as their instrument. So this is why I bring this up. You ever had buzzes coming through with your keyboards and yeah, it's picking up interference when it's coming from the keyboard to your soundboard at the back or wherever it is. It's picking up interference from whatever, all sorts of reasons. And so another thing that some of these have, most of them have actually, is what we call a ground lift switch. Especially with electric guitars, you can plug into an outlet over here, and your soundboard is plugged into an outlet over here, and the grounds don't match. Well, the direct box will lift the ground, and basically everything is still grounded, but it isolates the ground, so you're on different ground legs. Just because you have a balanced cable doesn't make the whole connection balanced. If you went to Home Depot, got an orange extension cord and it has 3 prongs, it's grounded, right? What eventually happens? The ground breaks off and you just have a 2-prong extension cord, right? Is the extension cord still grounding whatever you're plugging into? You can have a grounded cable, but you're no longer grounding the equipment. So the same thing holds true with balanced and unbalanced cables. The cable has to have 3 conductors in it, firstly. But secondly, the connectors also have to have 3 conductors. And I have a picture, the next one actually, where I'll show you some different connector types. An XLR cable is typically, if you buy an XLR microphone cable, it typically will be a balanced cable. But you can't always, if you've made your own or somebody has given you one or whatever the case may be, it may no longer be that because they may have done some wiring inside and soldered it and joined 2 wires together. So you can't always tell by looking at it. If you pull it apart and there's 3 individual connectors soldered in 3 different individual places on both ends, it's probably a balanced cable. Brian mentioned stereo versus mono. See if I can't show you this here. Let's see if this works. All right. You all see this handy little cable right here? See if we can't zoom in so you can see all 3 parts of it. See that black line, the 2 black lines going through right there? That is technically a balanced cable. Technically. What does it do on the other end? All right. Now I have 2 different connectors. It's stereo. It's not grounded, or it's not balanced. Because I have a ground, this outer ring is ground, and the center is the positive, the plug, the signal. So it's sharing ground, and then I have 2 different individual signals on it. So this mini plug, while it is a balanced connector, it's not a balanced connection. Does that make sense?
Which is often why you get buzzed when you plug a computer into your...
But you have a ground too, so you have a ground.
You have a ground.
And
No, there's no signals on ground. It's ground. I mean, it's a common. Yeah, I shouldn't say that. In a two-conductor system, it is a positive and a negative. So
So you can pick the bus from a computer by putting it through a direct box.
through a direct box. Depending where your computer is, you normally won't have issues. If your computer is right here and you have a 6-foot mini to RCA cable, you shouldn't typically have an issue. But if you're running a computer up on the stage and you just take one of these cables and you junction it all together and get it to the back, you probably will have an issue. Yeah,
So what would you do when you do plug a computer in and you get the bug?
direct box. This box here, it has RCA inputs on it. Some of them have mini inputs on them. Do you have computers at the front very often, regularly? Okay. They make direct boxes especially for computers. I have one at the office, actually, that I use for our corporate events or year-end meetings. It has a volume control right on it. Mini plug, XLR, volume control. So I can put it in a room, people can walk up to the podium, plug in their laptop, and they can adjust their own volume and have absolutely no worries. Your computer can also be the source of noise. Computer sound cards aren't notorious for their quality. So keep that in mind. If you plug in your headphones and you hear a little background humming and all this kind of stuff, your computer is the source. Plugging in through a direct box isn't going to really fix any of that. We had a room at Southern when I worked there. People were like, my computer's buzzing. We couldn't figure it out. We take our test laptop, plug it in, everything worked fine. On one time, the battery was dead, and we couldn't figure it out. We're like, what is going on? One time, the battery was dead on our test laptop, so we plugged it in, and we had a buzz. What in the world is going on? So one option is to get a FireWire USB external that not a USB to mini plug. I'm not talking about one of those. I'm talking an actual external sound card system that you plug in, you set up drivers, and your computer outputs sound to that, or data to that box, and that box converts it to sound. That gives you higher quality sound out if you are in that kind of situation. But it's not going to be cheap, I'll tell you that. Okay, so we have some connectors here. All sorts of good little stuff. When I was at Southern, we called it Connector Jeopardy, and they'd pull up a cable and say, all right, what is this? And that was our quiz for the day, all these different connectors, and we had to learn. Why is understanding what components you have and the proper terminology important? You're communicating to other parts of your team what you want. You're buying stuff. There was a guy, we made fun of him, but he meant well. We made fun of him more just as a joke. He knew what he was talking about. But he'd get sometimes where I need to connect this thing with that thingamajig over there, and it was this thing and whatchamacallit and all this, and it's like, what are you talking about? And we knew because we knew what he was talking about, but it can make communication difficult if you're using things and cables and what? So understanding the terminology, while it may seem basic, it's like it's a mic cable, who cares? Knowing what you have can help you in purchasing and replacing and talking to other parts of your team. So we have XLR cables. XLR cables, it's this big silver one up top, or that one there on the bottom. The top we call male, and the bottom we call female. If you buy a commercial microphone cable that's XLR, I would wager it'd be a pretty safe bet it's a balanced cable. But where you have to be careful, in this pile you can't tell. Say, for example, and actually one of these cables, this cable right here goes to this cable. Is that gold? Well, let's go to the next one and we'll make more sense of it. 1/4 inch. 1/4 inch, some people will call it a phone cable. Mostly it's 1/4 inch. And that's because of the thickness of it. It's a 1/4 inch across. So this gold cable here is a 1/4 inch cable. Remember when I was talking about the black rings on the mini cable earlier? There was 2. This one has 1. Do you think this is a balanced or unbalanced cable?
Unbalanced.
Or connector, I should say. All right? This plug is connected to that XLR cable. This bottom black XLR female is a balanced connector. But this gold 1/4 inch cable is not. That cable is not balanced. Because maybe they added this XLR female after. Maybe it was a 1/4 inch mono cable. And so somebody needed a 1/4 inch to XLR cable for whatever reason and didn't understand the difference between balanced and unbalanced. And so they just put this XLR cable connector on it. I got a 1/4 inch to XLR cable, done. If you open it up and you see 3 individual wires soldered to 3 individual connectors, it's balanced. But sometimes what they'll do in a case like a 1/4 inch mono or unbalanced to XLR is they'll join 2 of those wires together. And there's reasons to do that. I've done it in some situations. Just so 3 individual connectors going to 3 individual conductors on the connector. So 1/4 inch has balanced or unbalanced. Technically it's balanced and unbalanced, but you might hear people say 1/4 inch stereo, 1/4 inch mono, and just know the trade-offs there. RCA. You know what RCA cables are? Sometimes referred to the red and white cables. I will have people call up and say, I'm doing X, Y, and Z. Well, do you know what kind of connectors you have? Well, it's a yellow connector, or it's red and white, or okay. RCA is typically the red and white little, well, in this, the 2 that are red and white, RCA connectors. Consumer products, oftentimes, DVD players, CD players, whatever the case may be, is a common place for those. You have them on sound consoles. It was the biggest joke. We had a large, was it 40 channel soundboard at Southern? I think they've replaced it now with a digital one, but anyways, it's like 6 feet long, super professional console that met rider specs from Nashville artists and whatnot. And on the back of the stereo inputs were 2 RCA inputs. What? As well as 2 XLR inputs. That was the only board I've used that actually has 2 XLR inputs on a stereo input channel on a board. But 2 XLRs followed by 2 RCAs. It's just sort of kind of funny. But it's there because consumer equipment, oftentimes you're using them in churches, have RCA connectors. And most consoles have them on the output as well. You've seen record out. By the way, I never use those, but we'll talk hopefully a little bit more about that later on. And then 1/8 inch or mini cable, headphone plug, whatever the case may be. And you all have iPods and stuff that come into your churches, right? Play this track. We'll just touch on that for a minute. I will never, and I broke that rule once because the situation, and I asked myself why. I will never use somebody else's audio device to play a track. Never. Especially with phones now and all that other kind of stuff. They lock them, or you don't know where their song is, and it gets out of the menu, and you're fumbling. I'm ready to sing. Like you're fumbling, trying to find it.
They get a phone call in the middle of them singing.
And that was they get a phone call or a text message, whatever the case may be. So they bring you an iPod where doesn't matter. You don't understand that device. Secondly, you don't know how the volume relates volume-wise to your system. The same way that when I got back in the day, date myself now, I think I'll be all right with most of this crowd, you had cassettes come in. I'm not saying anything, I'm up there as well. You had cassettes come in. I would listen to it and find out how long the delay was until it started, get an idea if it started soft or loud or whatever the cue may be, and then I would re-cue it. And I'd cue it to where I thought it was and I'd try it, because sometimes they started right at the end of the leader, sometimes I didn't, and I hated somebody says, all right, I'm ready to sing, and you press play and you wait. So that CDs, some of you still get CDs to play tracks from? I will rip the CD to my computer and play it off of that. Because you can put it in pause, but how many CD players have you gone to? It's in pause and you press play and you're waiting, right? It spins down if it's not playing for a while. So you get tracks. I will put them on my computer. I will not play from CDs. When I'm doing large events now, your track must come to me on a CD or jump drive. I will not take phones. I will not take iPods. Not take cassettes anymore. We've gotten rid of our last cassette player. Hallelujah. I could go on. I won't. So I don't have a cassette player in our office, so that's how I deal with that. And I just say, this is the policy. With large events, we send out information beforehand. And so if you have large events, you're planning an Easter program or a Christmas program with lots of musicians, just communicate beforehand. You know, in smaller churches, you have to set the bar for what's accepted. I'm telling you what I would like if you're looking at the stars, you're shooting for the stars. If you're looking down here, I'm going to stand on my little soapbox for a minute. This is something that my boss when I first got to the union, he was emphasizing, and I can't thank him enough. It's very easy to look inside of our box. And I'm not meaning any offense here, but we watch Hope Channel, we watch 3ABN, and we go to our church and we say, we're not that much worse than them. And I'm not disrespecting Hope Channel. I'm just saying we're not that much worse than them. And I'm not meaning that they're bad. I'm just saying. Is that what non-Adventist visitors are comparing us with? They're comparing us to Dancing with the Stars, America's Got Talent, American Idol. That's what they see. And if that's what they're used to and that's what they want, why can't we do this? And then they come to our church and the microphones are squealing and the person gets up to speak and they're standing there for a minute while you're fumbling trying to get the track going, and this church doesn't have it together. I'm moving on. Joel Osteen, Gaithers, we're in the Bible Belt, right? So many people, take your pick. Let's look outside of the Adventist circle. And it's not just Adventists that do this. It's any large organization, any organization that tends to look at itself and compare that little microcosm with the larger organization. We're doing pretty well compared to sister church over here. I don't say, let's compare ourselves to Joel Osteen or whatever the program is to make our program like them. Let's look at that from the production standpoint.
Right.
There was one of the conferences I was at, they said how many, and I don't remember the exact stat, but if you look at how many mega churches there are in the U.S. versus how many traditional churches, I would say, Adventist, the majority of people in the country don't go to mega churches. Absolutely not. There is a very large market for traditional, smaller church-based organizations. So it's not that everyone has to have the big flashing lights and the $200,000 sound console and lighting, whatever the case may be. It's not that everyone has to have that, but let's look at production. Let's look at how good things are production-wise, not content-wise. Does that make sense? So now we start getting into the real hands-on. Now that we understand terminology, we can talk about what we're doing here. So we want to start at the source. What do I mean start at the source? If anyone's seen me at an event where there's an instrument I'm not familiar with, including a piano, I walk into a venue and I've never seen this piano before, I'm going to walk up to it. Dave's seen me do this. Open the lid, stick my head in. They're like, what are you doing? I'm listening to the piano. I'm starting at the source. Where is the sound coming out that I want? If you put your ear inside of a grand piano, a baby upright, whatever the case may be, the sound is different all over it. Well, you can put your ear next to one of the sound holes, and it's sort of a mid-sound, kind of muddy. I don't want to put a microphone there, do I? In live sound is different from recording. In live sound, I'll often put the microphone very close to the hammers because I want some distinguished sound so the audience can sing along with the hymn. They want to be able to tell when the chord is coming down and the beat of the song. Recording, you're going to put your microphones farther out and get a little more of the tone and everything of the piano. So in live sound, which is what we're sort of talking about, listen for the sound that you're wanting. You're comparing that to what you know to be right. And what do you know to be right? From what you've heard through your life, you've heard CDs by Jamie George, you've heard Dave's CDs, you know what a piano sounds like. You know what the instrument should sound like, right? So you're comparing this, what you're hearing to what you know to be right. All right, where do I get the closest for that? Now I can take my microphone and put it there. So we start at the source. It is the easiest way to improve sound, or usually it's the easiest way to improve sound. Check, 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 check. This is how some people like to hold the mic, right? Right up, da, 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 da. Check, 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 check. Check, check, 1, 2, check, 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 check. You hear how the sound changes? It's what we call proximity effect. So somebody that has the microphone right up on the mouth, you're getting a lot of plosives, a lot of the popping sound. You're getting a lot of that low end stuff. Bass singers especially will put it right there, and that just helps with that. But oftentimes, depending on the environment, people will say, stick your thumb out on the microphone, and your thumb touches your lips. That's sort of if you're holding the microphone. Other than that, you just want to be as close as you can without being right up on it, generally speaking. All right, so we want to check mic placement. We talked a little bit about that with vocal mics. With the instrument, if it doesn't sound right, go back, listen again. If a new speaker comes to your church, you have a guest speaker, as I'm talking to the person, I'm listening to their voice. Psychologically, I'm tuning into their voice and how it sounds so that when I put the microphone on and start EQing it, I know what I'm going for. It's not just whatever, it sounds good. I'm listening for how his voice sounds. Check your mic selection. Did you choose the right microphone for the job? A lot of churches, you may only have 2 or 3 microphones to choose from, right? Choose the best you have. In our church, we have, I think, about 3 microphones, generally speaking, outside of the pastor's mic and the podium, all the set. Some microphones, and you'll learn, an SM57 is another common one. It's used a lot on guitars, guitar cabinets, drums. So you start thinking, all right, a guitar is similar to, I could use it on the cello if I needed to. I could use it on a violin if I really had to, I suppose. So you're thinking instruments. An SM57, look at it next time. I don't have any pictures of this, but Google it. With a windscreen, and look at the next time the president speaks. The president for years, and I'm so bummed I missed it, Shure, who makes the SM57, actually did a webinar, and they didn't record it due to the sensitivity of it, on the SM57, talking to some of the people who have done it. That is the microphone, 2 of them, that they use at all presidential press conferences, and they've used it for years. There's also a very good voice mic, I should say. I wouldn't say singing, but for podiums and whatnot, you can use that. So you look at the microphones that you have, you Google them, you find out what instruments people are using them with, and then you start to see how to use them. So in our church, we have an SM57 we use for, say somebody brings in a Calhoun, a little beatbox kind of thing. We have an SM58 that we'll use for vocals. And then we have a condenser microphone. Well, one day the orchestra is playing. What am I going to use? I'm going to put a 57 out there, I'm going to put a 58 out there, or I'm going to put the condenser microphone. I only have 3 to choose from, so I'm going to use the condenser microphone. So go back, and if you're not sure, put them all out there and try it. People will actually put a microphone in front of the same 3 microphones in front of the same source and test them and just play around with them and see what they like. So if you didn't get it right, go back, check your mic selection, maybe try another one, see if that works. Check the mic technique. We talked about how you hold it, that type of thing. If that is wrong, everything else you do is just Band-Aids. You can't make, you've heard the term garbage in, garbage out. It applies with sound. You can't make sound better. Some singers spend thousands and thousands of dollars on processors to try to make the sound better. We don't have that kind of money. Let's start at the source. If we fix it at the source, everything else we do is going to be a lot easier. Input setup. Now the fun. Gain structure. The first thing I do when I'm setting up a microphone, even in a church where same microphone I used last week, same channel I used it, but I'm using it in a different place, a different way. See how my fader's all the way up? How many of you mix by the fader versus mix somewhere else on the board? A lot of you like your mixers like this. They all have to be right here at 0. How many of your boards look like that? It's okay to be honest. I've seen it more than once. It's not at 0. I have to fix it. No, you don't. Faders are made to move. That's why they're right here close to the front where you can access them. Run this fader all the way up. Now let's see what happens. It will probably ring. It should ring. So for those of you that are in the front, you may want to plug your ears a little bit, but hopefully it won't be too loud or too long. So up here at the very top is what we call the gain. This is your volume coming into the board, basically. There's a little preamp inside, and this is adjusting the preamp, but think of this as the volume into the board. I'm just going to talk into here. Check, 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 1, 2, test, 1, 2, check, test, 1, 2, check, testing, 1, 2, testing, 1, 2, 3, checking, 1, 2, 3, check, 1, 2. Hear how it's starting to ring? All right, so I'm going to back it off just a little bit. Check, test, 1, 2, check, check, 1, 2. I now know that during the service, I can't go any louder. If the person gets up to the podium and is way back here and is talking, what are you going to do? What often happens? You turn up the gain, right? And then it rings. Most common problem that I've seen in a church. I can't go any louder. That's my gain structure. But it's not enough to leave it there. This is where I was at a church and noticed that their outputs on their board were pegging all the time. All the time. I was like, it's distorting. What is going on? So I just stood back there and watched, and their output meter is just flying up all the time. On your speakers or your amps, there is also a volume. The ideal is you set it to match. So your little LEDs on the front of the amp or the speaker are lighting up, and they'll light up at 0 or they'll light up at whatever the case may be. You want that to light up at the same place on the input meter, on the output meter. If it says 0, if it's up at 0, you want your amp lighting up at 0 as well. Now I will tell you from experience, that's not how I often set it up. I set it up based on the room. So in this room, it's not that big of a room. My amp is at 9 o'clock, which means it's like 3 clicks from off. Is there anything wrong with that? Not really. And now, an engineer is going to come in here and say, I'm not doing it right, whatever. It works. In a larger room, I'm going to have to turn that up. What is my goal? I want to be sending enough sound out of the soundboard that there's volume going through it. I want to see my meters bouncing up and down. But I don't want them pegging. Because as soon as I peg, I have distortion. So gain structure isn't just on the board, it's also on your amp. All right, everyone clear on that? The next thing I'm going to do is adjust my EQ. Number 1, you see this switch here that says low cut? Sometimes on the board it's up top. I'm going to make sure it's on. It's already on in this case. It's on, pressed. Some digital boards, the Personas, it has a low cut frequency that you can sweep and set. We call a high pass filter. Everything above that frequency goes. Everything below it is blocked with a curve. But in a male voice, there's hardly anything below 100, 120 hertz. I can cut all that stuff out and just clean it up. So if you have some instrument on stage or something that's causing in that lower frequencies, it's going to come through that mic. Well, I'm adding extra stuff that I don't want, right? So I just cut it all out. I don't have to worry about that problem. So my low cut is on. If I turn it off, do you hear much of a difference? There's a little difference, right? But very minor. And so I just cut it out. That will also help with your plosives.
Pulpit rumble.
Pulpit rumble, yep. So I just vocal mic, press, start with. Then I'll just EQ so that it sounds good. And this is going to be a little more difficult since I'm behind the speakers. But always cut before adding. For me, it's second nature, but for some people, I'm missing this, and so they add it. Oh, well, now I'm missing this, and they add it. And oh, I'm missing this, and they add it. Well, all of a sudden you run out of stuff, but all you were really doing, all you really needed to do was cut one frequency. So cut before add. Testing 1, 2, check, 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 check. Just because I like to clean up the low end, I'm going to turn that off, or turn it down. Check, check, 1, 2. All right, so let's see what happens. We have here the higher frequency. Check, 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 1, 2. Check, 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 check. Check, testing 1, 2. Check, test 1, 2. You hear how that changes? Check, testing 1, 2. Check, check. The upper frequencies can add clarity, but too much it can be harsh. So you want to play with that accordingly. This one particularly here is set at 12 kilohertz, which is fairly high. Sometimes you might also adjust this one for your sibilance. Sally saw seashells at the seashore. Some people are worse than that than others. The main frequency, you haven't heard really much change though in my vocals as I'm turning these though, right? There's a little change, but not a lot, not drastic. Most of the problem is here in the middle. This particular board, which is why it's out here, we have what we call a sweepable mid-frequency. So I'm going to turn this mid-frequency down. We want to cut before add, right? And I'm just going to turn this frequency and sweep. Check testing 1, 2, check testing 1. Let's turn this down, we'll make it a little more drastic. Check test 1, 2, check testing 1, 2, testing 1, 2, testing 1, 2, check 1, 2, test 1, 2, check test.
A little closer, please. That's too close. Yeah, there you go.
All right, we'll start back here again at the beginning. All right, so I've turned down. This is the volume. I turn it down. And I don't know what frequency I need to fix. So I just turn it down, and now I just sweep through the frequencies until I find which one is the problem, or area. Check test, testing 1, 2, test 1, 2, check, check, test 1, 2, testing 1, 2, 3, test 1, 2, 3, check, check, 1, 2. You hear that changes? I'm cutting out the upper frequencies, and so you're hearing the lower frequencies. Well, it sounded better back here, right? Check, 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 test. So I'm cutting out about 500 hertz, a very common frequency to have to reduce in vocal applications. Testing 1, 2, check, test 1, 2. I would wager that in this room, that frequency is a problem. So if we had a house EQ, I could cut that out and it wouldn't be an issue. If I had multiple microphones, I'd probably have to cut that all the way across. Just a hunch. Everyone understand how that EQ is working?
Does that reflect the person's voice? In other words, different folks will have different voice. So if you're cutting, maybe you are taking away from their voice or adding something that's not there.
The question is is that for that one person's voice, or is it uniform? It's a little bit of both. Every person will absolutely be different, and how those frequencies interact with the microphone there'll be nuances. And so just because it's set, EQ is not a set and forget. That's why I have it right there on the soundboard that I can adjust it. But it is also somewhat relevant to a microphone. So on a particular microphone, in my particular application, I may know that I may always need to boost or cut depending on what I'm doing. With instruments, it's fairly standard. If you go to Google and type how to mic a piano, and they'll say use an this isn't what they'll say, but use an SM58 and use two SM58s or an SM58 and an SM57. Let's just say an SM57 on the higher end and an SM58 on the lower end. Generally, mic a piano with two microphones, higher and lower, so you can get the full range. SM57 on the higher end and roll off everything below 120 hertz and add a peak at 5 kilohertz, and that's probably not even close to right, but you get the idea. On the SM58, a slight boost around 250 hertz and start to roll off everything above 2 kilohertz. Again, not right, because you still want some upper frequencies in your lower frequencies, it's just how it works. A kick drum, oftentimes people will go and they'll crank the lows and they'll cut off all the high, and the kick drum sounds terrible. So anyways, so instruments, there's going to be some common practices you're going to do. But every instrument's a little bit different. So you get that violin, what that's telling you is what frequencies should you pay attention to. So I may need to boost a little more, or instead of being 500, maybe it should be 400. So it gets you in the ballpark. Is that a long answer to your question?
Nathan, earlier when you started talking about the gain control,
Mm-hmm.
you're referring to a volume on the amp. Where is that specifically?
Okay.
Show, I didn't quite understand.
Gain is always up at the top.
Right. You were
Oh, on the
saying-
amp?
You were saying after you set this,
Okay.
you were referring to another volume setting.
On the amplifier, it's going to be on the front.
Oh, you don't have one up there.
On this particular amp, and I know this isn't smooth, and so those of you that are here for this afternoon, you can criticize me later. Can we get in there? Can't really see it, but it's right here. There's just a knob that
So you're
turns
saying
up.
you set that controls the house setting.
That controls the volume going out to the speakers. And so what I was saying is, you want enough volume leaving your soundboard. If your amp, all right, let's just play with this here, see what happens. I turn my amp up all the way because I just need my amp all the way up. Well, you hear the buzz, right?
Right away, right.
So problem number one, bring it back a little bit. There's still some buzz in there. We're just gonna say it's good. All right.
So check 1 2, 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 check. Check 1 2, 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 check.
So if I come down here, and this isn't a perfect illustration, but it shows the case.
Check 1 2. These meters here are barely moving, all things considered. Check 1 2, test 1 2. Check.
It's only going up four LED lights. Whereas if I turn this amp back,
Check 1 2, check test 1 2, check 1 2. Check. You see there's a lot more movement there in the meters?
the audio console is sending a lot more sound. That gives you a lot more control of your sound by utilizing the output, utilizing the full scope of the mixer. Now, what I was saying is you don't want that peaking. Your loudest part of the service, you don't want that hitting the red. So you want to make sure that you always want to make sure you have enough headroom in your system to go louder, but that you're not so quiet that your soundboard is just barely making a squeak. Okay?
Now, you just mentioned headroom. I see you have your fader maxed out.
Yes. Yes.
That doesn't give you much. If you need to just go a little higher, you're maxed out now. So you just have an option of turning off the amplifier, which is not a good thing.
What happens if I go louder if I've set my gain correctly on my soundboard?
If you go louder,
If I go louder, if I've set my gain right, what will happen? If I've set my gain right, remember I was showing you I set my gain until it rings and I back it off just a little bit? If my fader's all the way up and I want to go louder, all right, well, let's just demo this. Because this is how lots of churches are, so we want to be sure that everyone understands this.
Check 1 2, check 1 2, check test 1 2, check test 1 2, testing 1 2, test. There's the ring right there.
That sounds familiar.
All right, so this is how your soundboard looks at church, right?
That sounds right there.
All right, I want to go louder.
Check, test, 1, 2. Check. I can't do that. I don't need any headroom in my fader if I know that I've already maxed it out without causing problems.
Okay,
Does that make sense?
yeah.
Check, test, 1, 2. Check, 1, 2. Check.
I'll often recheck my gain after IEQ and massage it a little bit if I need a little bit more volume. Podium mics especially are a key place where you have to massage a little bit so I can get as much volume as I can without it feedbacking or ringing. But I don't need more headroom in my fader because there is no more headroom. It reminds me of something I meant to mention earlier, but you're working with your praise group, worship group. They're singing hymns, they're singing praise songs. It doesn't matter. I think I have it later on. Get to know them beyond the first name. If there is a respect from them to you, and you have a respect of them, you all understand what each other's role is. My job as a sound person is to make you sound as good as possible. Oh, great. What do I need to do to help you do your job better? And this relationship is reciprocal. If you set your gain, you will never adjust your gain again during the service. And I've worked, I mean, you're always working with different people. I've been there. You set your gain with a podium mic is a common situation, right? Person walks up, before anyone gets to the sanctuary, and you don't have to do this every week. If you're the same operator and you know the settings haven't changed, the podium hasn't moved, whatever the case may be, you can set it and sort of let it go. You set your gain so that it doesn't ring. A person walks up with a nice boomy voice, you're mixing down on the fader. Remember saying mix on the fader? So the person is too loud. You just bring that fader down really quick. Done. You're not reaching up to, bring the gain down. Oh, there, I like that. Mix on your fader. That's why it's there. A spec to give you an idea, this board here has what we call a 60 millimeter throw. There's 60 millimeters that you can move that fader up and down. Nashville artists always want 100 millimeter faders. Why? So that you can mix on the fader. EQ, though, is where a person comes in with a big boomy voice. You're going to roll off the lower frequencies so it's not quite so boomy. And another person comes in who's got a really petite voice and you want a little fuller. You're going to bring up those low frequencies. So you're doing that on the fly. All you're doing, when I'm mixing, we'll say one singer, one person talking, prayer, welcome, announcements, whatever the case may be. One finger here on the fader, one finger up here on the EQ. And I'm adjusting the EQ to make it sound right, and the volume to make it, and the fader to make it right volume. That's how you can be quick.
So you're setting the gain according to the mic, not the person behind it?
Correct. Yeah. You can set the gain. If nobody is there, you can sort of set the gain, at least ballpark it in, with nobody there. I know this mic will ring at whatever point. And I'm going to back it off just a little bit more because I know from experience, when sound is coming through it, it's going to be a little louder. So you can do all of that regardless of the person.
Somebody's talking here, and I turn it up, it starts to ring. Somebody comes in with a loud voice, doesn't matter. I'm just adjusting the perceived,
The volume now that you want out in the audience, you're adjusting that on the fader. I was in a situation I was in one place where people thought the EQ, they didn't know what they were doing, and all the EQ was below zero, all of it. When they're turning their gain up and they're bringing the EQ down, they're turning their gain up and you're playing cat and mouse. If all of your EQ is above or below zero, all of it, you're adding volume or you're decreasing volume. So it can't. I dance around that. I don't want to sound like a politician, but I'm dancing around that because it isn't. EQ does change volume of frequencies. Right. Okay.
When you were doing the frequency suite,
Mm-hmm.
you were looking for the frequency that gives problem. What criteria are you using to
Okay? The question was, how do you know what you're looking for when you're adjusting EQ? What's the criteria? I want it to sound normal. So when I'm talking to a guest speaker or the pastor, I'm listening for his voice for what's normal. And then I'm adjusting that EQ to as closely match that as possible.
So is the EQ truncating that frequency that it's on?
It's one way of saying it's reducing it. It's not stopping it, but it's reducing it. Yeah. Or amplifying it, if the case may be.
Now, what if you're doing inserts, compressors, and things of that nature? Where are we going to go with the volume?
Okay, that's a good question. I wasn't talk. I didn't have.
I didn't jump ahead.
No, absolutely. I didn't have inserts as part of this, but I'll be glad to absolutely talk about it. Inserts take the signal after your preamp, does some stuff to it, and sends it back into the board. A usual case for a insert will be a compressor. Compressors, what they do is if the volume coming in increases by say 3 dB, dB is a measure of unit of measuring sound, by 3 dB, and you set your compressor to a 3-to-1 ratio, it will only increase the sound by 1 dB. Everyone understand sort of the concept of a compressor? I had a demo. I don't think we're going to get to it. So that's what a compressor does. How does it relate to the overall volume? Is that your question? This is why we set gain first. Because if I set my gain, it affects everything else down the line. If I don't set my gain and I'm adjusting my volume up here on this, it's adjusting my compressor settings. So that's that relationship. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Does the gain change if the mic location changes, if you have roving mics?
Yes, and that's the problem with roving mics. It's hard, and this is where getting to know your equipment is very important. And when I say getting to know your equipment, not just what you have and how to use it, but how it works in different situations. In our church, we use a handheld wireless microphone for the Sabbath school. The Sabbath school is down in the seats, in front of the microphone, or in front of the speaker. Well, I have to have different gain settings there than if it's up on the stage. And so you sort of have to, if your roving microphone is always on your stage, set it for the worst spot. That's sort of, does that help? Okay.
What's your take on feedback eliminator or destroyer? We had a gentleman who came, we had a working session last week at our church. They were talking about technology, and we had several great folk came in, and this is one of the items he mentioned about a piece. So give me your take. I think I know what it is already. Yeah.
I am not a fan. I'll just put it that way.
Okay.
And other sound techs I have talked with are also not a fan.
Right.
Have I thrown them in occasionally? Yes. As a very last-ditch effort. And they were removed after that event. So they're part of my processor that goes out to the speakers. I have that option and I threw it in. What a feedback eliminator does is try to find frequencies of feedback and cut it out with what we call a parametric EQ. So we've talked about a main EQ on a soundboard. Well, a parametric EQ is very, very narrow. And so it'll try to pull out, if you have a ring at 8 kilohertz, it'll just pull out that little bit and feather it back out. What you're also doing, though, is what some sound engineers would consider destroying the audio, because you're pulling out all these little bits. And so, yeah, I would say that in a properly set up environment, running your EQ efficiently, you shouldn't really need them. You have monitors at church, right? You have mother's rooms, cry rooms, overflow rooms. You're recording. How do you get all the stuff out that you want? And we talked about inserts, and that's a perfect segue into Aux Sends. If we don't set our gain first, everything we do changes later on. So you have a singer up front and you're singing, you've got the worship team all set up right, you think, and somebody else uses that mic, and you change the gain, and the music group comes back during Sabbath school, say. The music group comes back during church, and my monitor isn't right. I didn't change your monitor. I didn't change it. Did you change your gain knob? You did change their monitor. So you understand how setting your gain first, it just has domino effects all the way through the chain. Let's see if we can run through here without, while making sense of it, but still explaining it. I'm not going to zoom out all the way because this is going to use the full board here. And turn this one off. On a Mackie board, Aux Sends are not affected by the mute switch. You can mute it, but it doesn't mute the Aux Sends. This is what we're talking about. All right. So this will be a little hard to tell because the speakers are all in the same place. All right, so this will loop through here. All right, this is going through the main speakers. And I'm adjusting it with the fader. Okay? Now you have a monitor. I believe they are these little speakers right here on either side. Okay? So if you can see here, I'm adjusting this top red dial that says aux. On this board, I'm going to kill this channel. It doesn't. On this particular board, the aux 1 and 2 sends there's a button that's pre or post. Some boards are by default post or post fader or pre. On 1 and 2 they're by default pre fader. So I'm going to show you the difference between pre and post, and then explain the application. See how I adjust the fader up and down, and the volume goes with it? That's post fader. The fader is affecting the volume going out. Now, if I hit this pre button, it makes it pre fader. I didn't do anything to hit that button. I adjust the fader, it's not changing the volume. Everyone hear that? It's all right here. So application. Pre-fader will be, make sure I get this right. Pre-fader is not affected by the fader. So that would be where you run things like monitor sends, where whatever you do doesn't change it. Because a vocalist, an instrumentalist, wants to hear the same volume irregardless of what you do. What you're doing is mixing for the house. The aux sends in pre-fader mix for them. That for the musicians. Okay? So you have the famous bass player, more me. Here you go. More you. All right? So post-fader, what other applications outside of your sanctuary will you want to control the balance? Cry room, streaming, recording. Now I can send stuff there that's on a different send from my house mix. So I'm not like, well, I only have one main out. How do I get it there? I could run splitters, or you could just run it through an aux send, 5 and 6, or a post-fader aux send to your overflow room, to your streaming room, or streaming.
Separate from the main.
Separate from your main.
So when you control the main, don't shut everything down.
It is tied to your main mix, so it's still balanced, but you're sending it other places. Now here's the real key to this. What good is streaming camp meeting or listening to the recording afterwards and you can't hear the audience sing, or you can't hear the audience clap, or respond, they laugh, they say amen. You can't hear any of that. What fun is that to the streaming side? No fun, right? So you set up audience microphones, or maybe in the main sanctuary you don't need the choir microphone, the choir mic, but streaming, well, what good is that if they can't hear the choir and all you got is a choir, right? This is why I say this is going to take the whole board. Down here, there's these gray buttons that assign it, and so I can assign it to 1 and 2, 3 and 4, left and right. Well, this is assigned to 1 and 2. Let's say that this is a choir mic. let's pull it, let's not assign it to 1 and 2. It's no longer going out of the main speakers. All right? Now, I can send this irregardless. Oh, I did that wrong. All right. This is where it's going to be hard to tell. This is coming out of 2 speakers right now. Can you hear that, people in the front? Okay. I can pull down main. You still hear it. I bring it up. Okay. So I have a separate mix. So if I unassign it from main, main no longer does anything. Okay, are we all clear on how we got there? This is an audience mic. I want to send it to streaming and recording. Now I can. This is your streaming signal. Now I can put audience mics inside of my streaming signal, still controlling them through the main mixer, but not causing any problems with feedback or anything else. That make sense? So, all right, a common setup for me. Monitors are on 1 and 2, and my streaming is on 5 and 6. That makes sense? 5 and 6 are post-fader, 1 and 2 are pre-fader. The other benefit of post-fader, the other way you can use this is, say you are miking a piano. The piano needs to be mic'd in your sanctuary, but not very much. But on streaming, you need a lot more piano because you don't want to just hear the piano tinkling away in the background. You want to be able to hear it. So, okay, so on a post-fader mix, you know how you're getting there. I'll set, generally speaking, set them all the same, so that when I'm mixing on it's relational, right? When I'm mixing on the faders, they're all going up by the same amount. I don't want vocalist 1 and vocalist 2 being mixed differently for my streaming. Does that make sense? But say your piano, you need more. Just turn that piano aux send up. All right, so we'll say that this same track is my piano. Normally, I set it at 0. All right, normally I set it at 0. But in this case, I need more piano going to streaming than everything else. Clear? Make all of your external stuff post-fader. So this aux section in post-fader is another mixer, but its tied to your faders. So if I set one at 1/4 and I set the next one at 3/4, the one at 3/4 is going to be a lot louder, relationally. But when I bring my faders down, they're all 0. That make sense? Mixers are all different. Some of them are by default. The first Aux Sends are pre-fader by default, and you can't set them. And the bottom ones are selectable. So your mixer will vary. If you know what model it is, we can look it up and try to explain a little bit, but the idea is pre- and post-fader. One of the things I talked about in the description of the course, of the training, and we didn't touch on, and is imminent, as in a couple months from now, is what's happening to wireless. I won't talk the whole wireless section that I had, but let's talk a little bit about what's happening to the spectrum and how that affects us in churches. How many of you remember, it's been about 6-7 years ago by now, the whole thing on wireless, and people who had over-the-air TV had to get new antennas, converters, not antennas, but converters and all this kind of stuff. And some microphones were affected. Any of you have microphones that were affected? So you had 700 megahertz wireless microphones, right? This affects handheld microphones, lapel microphones, it doesn't matter. Well, the wonderful government has found another source of revenue, and they want to do some stuff again and sell off some spectrum. What it's looking like right now, and I at first thought it was going to be a lot worse, and I think some other people thought it was going to be a lot worse than it's shaping up to be, but I was just talking with I've been following Sure has been out in the front, working with government, trying to come to some amicable solutions that will work for everybody. There's Sennheiser as well and whatnot, but Sure has really been out there and been promoting it. Maybe it's just because I get their emails more, I don't know. But so I've been talking to them at trade shows. I was talking to a distributor probably about a month ago, if not even that long ago. And the distributor's take on it was, don't sweat it. And until then, I was thinking it was going to be a little bit worse. But unlike the 700 megahertz sell-off and conversion, the whole 600 megahertz isn't being affected. So wireless microphones use pockets of frequencies to get their signal from the transmitter to the receiver. Right now, well, always, we use what we call white spaces. Spaces that aren't being used by TV stations, generally speaking. So this looks pretty busy, doesn't it? Let's just take a minute to digest this. I've cut off the bottom half. This is the current situation. So you see these little blocks of white? This is what we call white space. This is where wireless microphones work, hang out, exactly. And in each one of these spaces, depending on the series of microphone, you can get 4 to, I think, 30 now in one model, 30 wireless microphones in one band of one TV band. So that's where wireless microphones have lived. And actually after the 700 megahertz sell-off, they did these 2 green bands that you see that were reserved exclusively for microphones. And the particular channels may be different in your area. People understand frequency agile systems. It means you can change the channel of the microphone. If you don't have a frequency agile system, you might have to change, or you ever have to change, get a frequency agile system. You're going to pay more, but it's going to give you flexibility in the future. So this is where we are now. Everyone's sort of clear what's going on now with all these different blocks or different TV channels. Everyone sort of understand that? This is what it looks like it might go to. One proposed solution, and this comes off of actually Sennheiser's site. Sure's been out there, and I know I was talking about that, but I couldn't find a graph that I liked that actually sort of showed what was going on. So all of this sort of depends on how many TV stations participate. Right now, there's not a lot, and I didn't look at the exact number, but there's not a lot of TV stations that have opted to possibly sell. The cutoff for that was a week or 2 ago, where a TV station could put in an application saying, we may participate in the auction. Other TV stations, so you had an option. Either I might participate or I won't participate. The cutoff for I might participate has passed. And the numbers haven't been through the roof, so we're not looking at doomsday scenarios. And then there's going to be another cutoff in a couple months, I think, where the auction will actually start. Then once the auction closes, then we'll know how many TV channels they have to move and reconfigure, and how much of this upper section, here we see uplink and downlink. What they're wanting is more space for cell phones. Now, I can go on a whole soapbox on that, but anyways, we won't for the sake of time. So cell phones want to use this space to get more data to your phone. How big this block looks will depend on how many TV stations participate. So we see here what's called the duplex gap. For licensed mic use, noise problems might exist. Licensed mic use, Super Bowl. Want to take a stab at how many different wireless mic frequencies are used at a Super Bowl?
500?
I think the number I've heard is 200. But nonetheless, it's a massive amount. And so they need big blocks of wireless mics. We were talking about Joel Osteen earlier. Their church uses a whole gamut of wireless microphone stuff. And it's not just microphones, it's intercom systems and stuff that the refs use on the field. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that is used. So you can become a licensed user if you have large amounts of microphones that you use. Most of us, in our cases, I would say, aren't going to be licensed mic users. So we won't have to worry about this green space coming up. So we're not going to worry about that. Then there's these guard bands, because how white spaces work is in between TV stations, we need a little bit of a buffer area so there's no interference between the two. While your TV might tune, let's use a radio. Radio is set to 91.5. Sometimes if you go back to the old ones, you might find it at just above 91.5 or a little below, right? It sort of fudges a little bit. It comes in and it comes out, and you find the dead spot where it sounds the best. On those edges, if you pack in too many radio stations too tightly, you have interference, right? So the same type of thing. They have to leave gaps every so often to make sure that interference doesn't happen where you don't want it. So that's where wireless microphones come in. So what it's looking like after this repack, that we'll still have a large portion of the 600 megahertz area to use for wireless microphones, and it's still even looking like there's going to be a naturally occurring white space after this whole shuffle. So our 600 microphone is going to be banned. 700 microphones you can't use anymore by law. That isn't looking like what's going to happen to the 600s. Some of the higher end ones you can send back for reprogramming, which will, if you change channels, it'll just shift what channels you can actually adjust to make them all fit inside the area after the repack. But if you can't reprogram them, then just be aware of what frequencies you can and can't use, because you don't want to either cause or receive interference. And if you cause interference and you're reported, that could be an issue, because as the user, you have to responsibly and legally use your system. And you have to know what those parameters are.
What's the worst case
scenario? in use or in allocation?
Repercussion. I mean, I just mean, I'm not trying to be funny, because to replace, a lot of us don't have the budget to replace. And currently, if I'm not mistaken, I think some of our mics are on that 700 frequency, you said?
700s?
600.
600 is what we're adjusting now. 700s were about 6 years ago.
What's our frequency? What's the worst case scenario, the consequences we're looking at?
Worst case scenario, in that you're using a channel you shouldn't be, you're reported. Most likely, in a small church situation, the FCC, you'll get a letter, or the FCC will come and visit you, or a representative, or whatever the case may be, and they'll just say you can't be using this frequency. You'll most likely, it's the government, you never know what's going to happen, but most likely you'll get a warning. Okay?
Is there a way of knowing what frequency our mics use?
Yeah, somewhere on the transmitter and receiver, it will actually say either a channel, group, so to speak. So sure, they use like M1 or J1 or whatever, and that's their frequency blocks that they have self-assigned inside that terminology. But on the receiver and transmitter itself, usually there's also a place that lists the frequency ranges that it works between. And you have to look for those labels. It's on the front of a receiver, it will actually give you the number usually. It will say, so like on a Shure receiver, it will say Group 1, Channel 1, TV 37, frequency 624.375 in smaller numbers. I've used Shure a lot, that's how I know them, but the Sennheisers do the same thing, and other ones do as well. So if you're in 700s, I've said what I need to say. 600s, just monitor. All along, though, even now, and you'll just want to pay attention to once the whole thing happens. And everything's not going to change probably for a couple of years. It's going to take time for TV stations to ramp up and retune their transmitters and their antennas and all this kind of stuff. So there will be a transition period. Government's saying it's going to be a lot faster than what the industry is saying it's going to be. But Manufacturers will give rebates, most likely, for new equipment. It won't be free. It won't be a free exchange. But if you're looking at possibly upgrading equipment, now would be then would be the time. They're not, you may get $100 on a $500 system. It's not going to be a give to you. But and what they do is they turn around and they resell them potentially in other markets where it's still legal to use, or they'll retune them or whatever the case may be. So they're not losing money, but they're a business. They're going to find a way to sell you equipment. But just pay attention. It's not looking doomsday. You may not even have to replace any equipment. But once the auction happens, and this is where I was going with all of this, the manufacturer of your microphone, you can go to their website. Shure has one. Sennheiser has one. I know for sure those two. And the other ones I'm sure do as well. If not, you can use theirs and sort of figure it out on your system. And just manufacturer frequency finder or wireless frequency finder. And it will tell you the best frequencies to use in your area, even now. Maybe you have a little bit of interference on your wireless microphones now. Every so often it just comes in and out. Well, maybe you're not using the optimized frequencies for your area. After this whole shift, it'll be especially important to retune your microphones down to the areas that they recommend. And what they do is they have a database of all the transmission stuff in your area by zip code and licensed stuff. And then you can go and plug in, find your frequencies that will work. So does that answer questions and clear up anything on FCC and what's happening here in the future? You want to be sure that that's one of the biggest things that is coming up that will affect churches. That being said, wireless microphones, it's amazing. How many counterfeits there are out there. The distributor that I work with, he was like, you wouldn't believe the counterfeits. And they have gotten some and even sent them back to the manufacturers. Like, something doesn't look right, but I can't figure it. They got it because it wasn't working. And then they open it up and it's like, well, something doesn't quite look right, but I'm not sure what it is. They'll send it back to the manufacturer, and the manufacturer is pulling it apart, and everything is matching up, and they get to one little piece, and it's a counterfeit. So the counterfeiters have gotten very good at making bad equipment, no-name equipment, whatever the case may be, however you want to call it. So I wouldn't buy high-end, expensive, relatively expensive, whatever you want to call it. I wouldn't buy wireless microphones, period, off of eBay. I would buy it from a super reputable distributor. Let's talk about distributors really quick. We'll get to streaming. But there was a projector bulb distributor that was very out front in promoting using genuine bulbs for projectors for very legitimate reasons. Bad bulbs can blow up inside your projector, ruin them, and all sorts of stuff. So very out front in promoting brand bulbs. After some reports of bulbs not functioning correctly, they went through and looked through their inventory and found out that they had purchased from their supplier, somehow bad bulbs had gotten mixed into their batch, and they were selling counterfeit bulbs. So they issued refunds and replacements and all that kind of stuff for customers who had been affected. But you just have to be really careful with counterfeits. And if you use a super reputable distributor and they find an issue, there's a good chance that they might stand behind you and help you out a little bit, should that come to light.